In this episode of B.Hooked Knitting, we're going to learn how to pick up and knit on garter stitch along the side edge or the cast on or the bind off edges. These techniques are very important if you are ever planning to knit garments in the future. Well, come on, let's see how it's done. Before we get into the really quick demonstration on how to pick up and knit stitches along the side and along the cast on or the bind off edges, I want to answer a question that comes up pretty frequently, and I think it comes up because it's never been answered, or at least not that I have found online. So the question is, what needle do you use to pick up and knit stitches? Well, a lot of times if you're following a pattern, then, the pattern will specify if you're supposed to go up a size or down a size. In some cases, it will tell you to use a circular, but usually it's knitter's choice. So if you've never picked up and knit before, you won't have the experience to know whether you should be using a circular or a straight needle or a bigger needle or a smaller needle. We're going to cover that here. A lot of it is personal preference. Now, I used straight needles for a very long time when I first started out. It was, comfortable for me to work with. Honestly, I didn't know that you could use circular needles for flat knitting, so I didn't have any circular needles. That's why I used straights. Well, once I figured out that you can use circular needles for flat knitting, the rest is history. I have my straight needles. I very rarely use them. But, there is a time and a place for them. So I would recommend using a circular needle to pick up and knit simply because it's easier. It's, you have a smaller needle to hold on to in your hand. Typically, it's, it weighs a little bit less than maybe your straight needle that you have. But the other really good benefit is the cord. So the cord, as you can see, is very flexible on circular knitting needles. And that's the case for any. This is the Haya brand, and, I really love using these needles. But the cord is going to be flexible no matter what type of needle you're using. So no, you don't have to have this exact needle right here. That becomes really helpful, especially when you're knitting garments. So I had done a tutorial on a baby sweater about a month or so back. I'll link to that pattern if you're interested in trying out your first baby sweater. I highly recommend it. It's very easy. But you pick up and knit stitches along the armholes. And to do that, you really need to have either circular needles or double pointed needles because you're working in the round. So again, that was maybe a little bit more of a lengthy explanation of which needle to use when you're picking up and knitting, but hopefully that will answer some of the questions that are floating around out there as to which ones I use. So we're demonstrating the pick up and knit on garter stitch today. I will be releasing a pick up and knit on stockinette stitch next week, so you can look forward to that. Right now, the garter stitch is, I would say it was a little bit more complicated for me to learn how to pick up and knit, where to space them, how to make it look right, and, all of that stuff. So I learned the hard way. This is how I like to pick up and knit along the side so that I have a really nice, clean join, especially for garments. You spent so much time knitting them that it's a real shame when you have unsightly joins and you can't do anything about it. Okay, so the first thing you're going to need is find your starting point. And even before that, whatever side you have facing up or facing towards you, that is going to be the right side of your join. So you'll find that a little bit of the yarn is going to sort of fold on the inside when you pick up and knit these stitches, and that's going to create a seam on the inside. So whatever you want to be facing outward, make sure that's facing you when you're picking up and knitting. So the first thing I like to do is find the corner. I want to get as close to the corner as I possibly can. And again, as a rule of thumb, I try to get my needle under 2 strands or 2 loops. It typically just looks a little bit cleaner when we can do that. So we'll insert our needle into the first little space, and you'll just take your your new yarn, so I'm using a contrast so you can easily see it. You'll just fold it in half so you have a little bit of a tail, and then just place that on your needle. And you'll need to, pick it up and put some tension on there because it's a little tricky to get these new strands through without dropping them. And you'll probably see me do this once or twice. I usually have to fiddle with it a little bit to get it through there. Okay, so once you have the first stitch, then, I'll just pick up, I don't have to hold on to that tail anymore, so I'm just going to pick up my working yarn, and I'm going to locate the next slot where I think it looks right. So what I like to find is the little V, so I'll separate these two ridges or these two rows, and when you do that, you see a V that's right next to the edge. So I just like to insert my needle into that V, then you'll wrap the yarn and pull it through. Then I will skip the next ridge and I'll go in between them. See how when I open that up, you can see this V right here. I'm going to insert my needle in the V, wrap the yarn, and pull it through. And I'm just going to repeat that until I get to the end of the row. The most important thing to keep in mind when you're picking up and knitting is keeping everything consistent. The only right way to do it, at least in my opinion, is a way that looks good, right? That doesn't give you holes in your work, that doesn't give you a jagged or a funny looking join. So you might have to play with this a little bit. Pick up and knit, and hopefully you don't have a huge row. What I do is I'll pick up and knit, I'll look at it, and if I feel like it looks funny after knitting the first row, I'll pull it out and I'll try again, because it's a small loss of time at that point when you've only knitted one row. So if you were to go on, sort of ignore what you think it could be a problem if you have a stitch that's crooked, then by the time you finish your sleeve, let's say, you have so much more time invested in it. So you want to make sure that you are just taking care and paying attention to this stuff when you only have just one or two rows. So when you come to the end, you're going to try to maintain your pattern as much as possible, where you insert your needle into the stitch and try to get it as close to the edge as possible. And that's what it looks like on your first row. Now you've probably noticed that your stitches are pretty tight when you pick up and knit. And that's okay, that happens. It's going to be a little bit uncomfortable. Again, that's kind of why I like the cords here, because once the stitches slide past the needle, then I don't have that tension, kind of pulling on it. So what you can do if you have a serious issue about picking up and knitting, your stitches are way too tight, you just can't make it work, then go up a needle size. That's going to help you to get your stitches a little bit looser so you can get your needle into them and work them. But if you do that, make sure you work your first row with the needle size that your pattern calls for. Otherwise, you're going to change your gauge and things will be all downhill from there. So this is how I would pick up and knit along this row. This is what it looks like on the first one. Now I do want to talk a little bit about the technique I was using. You notice, if you've watched any of my videos, I go back and forth from continental and American style knitting, or English style knitting, which is, English and American, where you hold the working yarn in your dominant hand. Continental knitting mean you hold the yarn in your non-dominant hand. Now what I have found is that I personally cannot pick up and knit continental style. It just doesn't work. I can't keep the loops on the needle. I tend to fight with it a little bit more than it's worth. So if you are a continental knitter, then I do recommend that you at least give this a try. I think you'll find it a lot easier. So what would you do from here? Well, you can see that little seam that I was telling you about, and that seam is going to grow the further in you get. So we tried to catch that first stitch on the side there. If we were to go in another stitch, then of course we would have a larger seam on the second side. So all you would need to do from this point on, now again we're working in garter stitch, is just continue, whatever your stitch pattern your pattern calls for, you would go ahead and do that. So for this little demonstration, I'm just going to knit every stitch. I want to give you an idea of what it looks like after your first row. So when you get to your very last stitch, you want to use a lot of caution because we have a loose end here. So if I am not careful, I can just pull this stitch out, and we don't want that. So you want to keep things nice and tidy. This will sort of straighten itself out once you knit the first stitch. So what I'll do is I'll just kind of hold it off with one of my fingers while I'm knitting this last stitch. And you'll knit the stitch, and if it's still a little bit loose, you can just sort of tug on that end and tighten things up. So you can see with this method where we're putting one stitch in between each one of the ridges, that matches the pattern really well. When you're knitting going in the opposite direction, so when I knit this little swatch, I was working, in rows this way, and when I pick up and knit along the sides, now I've switched that. So I'm knitting, this way on top of the side of that. Typically, knitted stitches are wider than they are tall. So you want to consider that when you're picking up and knitting stitches. And like I said, a lot of trial and error went into this, and that's what I found looks the best and works the best for me. Now before we get into picking up and knitting stitches on the cast on or the bind off edge, I want to show you how simple it is to rip this out. If you find that it's not working out like you want it to, if your stitches look a little scrunched or uneven in any way, it's so easy to go through and take these out. So just remove your needle, pull your working yarn, and there we go. Now you'll see, a couple of the little holes, but you can typically kind of finger block those out if you need to pick up and knit along, a different set of stitches. Okay, so picking up and knitting stitches along the cast on edge, which is down here, or the bind off edge, which you'll see up here, the technique is exactly the same. What you want to look for is the V's at the top of the stitch. So we see that each stitch has a little V, and that's where we're going to work our stitches to pick up and knit. So I'm going to find the first stitch, insert my needle under those two, and then we'll work this the same way, just kind of fold it in half. And then pull that through. Again, that first one is always a little bit hard, especially if your yarn starts to come unplied like mine is here. When we're working along the edges in the same direction that our original swatch here was worked, we don't have to worry about, skipping stitches. A lot of times the general rule of thumb when you're picking up and knitting stitches on the side is that you'll knit 3 stitches and you'll skip 1. That works out really well. Your pattern will usually indicate if that's what they want you to do, but for the cast on and the bind off edge, that's not the case. You can pick up and knit 1 stitch in every V. Now what I find is that picking up and knitting stitches on the cast off edge is a lot more difficult for me because the cast off is usually quite a bit tighter than especially the side and the bind off. So you can really only get your needle in there so far, and pulling them through sometimes takes a little work. What I like to do is I'll steady my finger over the working yarn so that way it doesn't slip off the tip of the needle, and I'll slide it through. The other thing you want to be cautious of is the yarn that you're using. Now you can kind of see here that this yarn is plied, and it's really easy to, sort of come unplied. So you can see there, just a little bit of twist will sort of make it unravel. And that's kind of your worst nightmare when it comes to picking up and knitting stitches. So if you can, especially when you're practicing this technique, if it's new, use yarn that you know is not going to come unplied or that is just generally not difficult to work with. The other thing you'll want to keep in mind is doing sort of a tension check every so often, because it's so difficult for us to pick up and knit in, these really tight stitches that we have here. Then that is going to mean that our first row here is going to be a little bit more tighter than we would like for it to be. So just because we're sort of working against the tension, we want to just do a check, and you'll see me kind of pull my needle. So I'm making sure the stitches are along the correct gauge of the needle. So what would you do if you were picking up and knitting on the cast on edge? Well, your cast on edges are always going to be a little bit more loose than your bind off edge. You'll still look for the V. Now, it's not usually a perfect V. It sort of depends on the cast on method that you used. I did a long tail cast on for this little swatch. And so you would just find each one of the V's and work your needle under those. And that's where you would pick up and knit those stitches.